Hey, what's up? It's Phoenix, and welcome back to my Philosopher Series. I'm Phoenix, and today I'm going to talk about the philosophy of Plutarch, who was an ancient philosopher. And I'm very excited to talk about Plutarch and specifically his notions of reason versus emotion. And it'll be very nice to be able to discuss this today. So without further ado, let's dive right in. Now, there are two components or feelings that Plutarch focuses on, and that includes contentment and anger. Now, it seems as though the overall project of Plutarch, when reading his essays, deals with the idea that negative emotions or emotions that can cause harm should be checked. They should definitely be challenged, and this would include anger. And so part of what this means is that Plutarch is hoping, as you would find in the philosophy of Stoicism as an example, or even just the history of philosophy in general, he is hoping that he can have a very moderate and relaxed sensibility, that he can find contentment in his life, and that we can find contentment through certain principles, which are often like Stoicism, which you may remember in my video on Marcus Aurelius. And it seems as though what Plutarch is really advocating for is an understanding that we can keep our negative emotions in check. There is a way that we can understand the world better by using rationality and reason to be able to mitigate or mediate our strong emotions, and that therefore allows us to be able to work through what we may feel that may not be immediately beneficial. Now, how accurate is such a belief? It seems as though there's a lot to it. On the one hand, I have heard claims that it is really important that we understand our emotions and that we understand what we are feeling, which means that we should balance them. But some people may actually be more passionate in life and assume that emotion should be expressed no matter what, that the point is the emotion. I myself have thought about this question a lot because I think that there is a lot there to consider, and I don't think that it is an easy question, although one thing that I do agree with Plutarch on is this idea that emotions definitely need to be mediated to some degree. They need to be balanced. And Plutarch has a lot of good ideas about these kinds of things, specifically with anger. Now, Plutarch describes anger as a negative emotion. Obviously, we don't want to dismiss negative emotions out of hand and see them as irrelevant to what we are feeling. We also don't want to overemphasize rationality at the expense of feeling. But it does seem to me that there is some truth that anger can be destructive in some ways, which is why we need to keep it in check. And I think this is a very important thing to realize. There is another notion that Plutarch talks about in relation to anger, but also strong emotions, and that is the notion of emotional restraint. It seems as though the idea is that we should be able to maintain our emotions, and sometimes that does include restraining them, which would include having some degree of self-control. And again, I've already pointed out some of the difficulties of such claims, such as the idea that our emotions are very real and that we have to honor them and feel them. On the other hand, there might also be a degree of truth that anger unchecked can do loads of damage, and that we have to be able to appreciate the emotions and even have some degree of restraint on the things that we feel. Now, I know that emotions, especially emotions such as anger or frustration, can be very hard to handle, and I know that they can be hard to feel. And so, from my own perspective, I don't want to limit these emotions. On the other hand, I do think that we need to acknowledge that emotions can be very powerful and that they do influence the world around us and that we need to be self-aware. We definitely need to be aware of these emotions. And so even though I wouldn't take the rhetoric as far as Plutarch might and say that we need to restrain these emotions in every instance, so to speak, I do think that it's valuable to be able to have that self-control, to realize that there are a lot of good things that we can understand about our emotions if we are able to maintain them and mediate them in a good way. One thing that I think Plutarch describes that I think is really helpful is when he discusses the consequences of something like anger, where anger does indeed hurt people that are close to us. It does create conflict and problems, and there might be a place for that anger, of course, but it's also very apparent that the anger can push away people that we love. I often think of this, which is why in my own life I think about how I want to be able to monitor feelings such as anger, because I don't want to have those destructive impulses that might lead to problems later on. And so I do think there is value in this, and I do think the idea is that we need to be careful. We need to be aware of what our anger is doing in real time, and we need to be aware of what that anger leads to. Now, Plutarch does seem to think that anger isn't useful. He definitely, as I've stated, has very strong rhetoric surrounding certain emotions, such as anger, and even just having a balance of emotions. And it does seem as though Plutarch thinks that anger, or emotions like anger, aren't actually useful. And this is a very powerful claim, because I do want to argue against this claim, because I do think there is a place for anger and a way of expressing anger, but certainly we want to be able to recognize what we are actually feeling. And it might be true that some emotions, depending on the way that we use them, are not useful, but that doesn't mean that the emotion itself is not useful, and this would be another point where I depart from Plutarch's perspective. Nonetheless, I do think that the value in it is in thinking about how anger can definitely lead to unwanted and unproductive outcomes, and this is why I take these ideas seriously, with at least thinking about the consequences of our emotions, and why I do think that Plutarch is right, that part of the goal is to be able to monitor our emotions with rationality, to be able to use reason to understand what we are feeling and what we can do with those emotions. I do think that there is a lot of value in that. Now, contentment is definitely a part of life as well, and I would describe Plutarch's notion of contentment as being another way of balancing what we feel. So even though Plutarch doesn't exactly go into too much detail about other negative emotions, he does seem to imply that we can have contentment in life by keeping those powerful emotions in check, by realizing all of the things that we already have, by realizing all of the things that we have access to, and by being grateful to the things that we get to experience in life. I do think that there is a lot of power in this claim, the idea that we can feel contentment, that we can feel the contentment of our reality and of our lives by thinking about it and by monitoring the emotions that could destroy that for us. And so I do think that it is definitely valuable to think about contentment as a possibility and something that we should strive for, and something that, as Plutarch would say, we already have. Indeed, one of Plutarch's ideas is that our outlook does determine the way that we perceive events. And this seems to be a very important thing to keep in mind, because we have to remember that the way that we look at something and the emotions that we filter our understanding through can definitely be complicated. And so again, Plutarch is rooting for the idea of rationality as being a way of monitoring and balancing our moods and our feelings and the way that we look at the world. And I do think that there is a lot of truth in this, because I think that it is so easy for our emotions to color the way that we look at the world and not realize the happiness that we already have. If we focus too much on the negative, which is something that is very easy to do, we don't pay attention to the positive things that are around us. It is very hard to find contentment if you're always pushing yourself to be able to experience something better, if everything is only about the end goal. The reality is, as I've seen, is that we will never reach that end goal per se, because there are always new things that we will consider and always new things that we will experience. As they say, the journey is an extreme part of our adventures. And so I think it's definitely important to keep in mind that our outlook does determine the way that we perceive events, and that the more that we can be aware of how we look at things and how we look at events, the more that we can understand what we are experiencing, and the more that we can find that contentment. Now, I've been thinking a lot lately about how it's very easy to make comparisons. It's definitely very easy for me to make comparisons to other people, to other situations, to other things that I may want that I don't have. But I've noticed that those comparisons, as people have mentioned in many times, it does make me less satisfied. It makes me less contented. And this becomes a problem because it infringes on my happiness. We are doing better than we think that we are, and I think that it's important that we keep this in mind. I think it's important that we realize that we don't want to compare ourselves to other people because we don't want to add more suffering to our lives by expecting ourselves to have certain things that probably wouldn't ultimately make us that happy in the end. And so I think that this is definitely something important to keep in mind. I am really taken in by this idea that our reality, our lives, are much better than we even think that we are. And it's very intense that this is the way that it can be, and that we need to remember this, that we need to remember that we already have so many great things in life, and I do think that there is value in such a view. Now, contentment and anger are two of the emotions or states of being that Plutarch talks about, but there are obviously many others that can be extrapolated from his works and from his philosophy. And it does seem to me that there is a role for reason, and as I've been saying, for balance, to be able to understand our moods and points of view, and to be able to understand what we already have. And a lot of this really is finding a balance, which we've seen with philosophers such as Epicurus, or again Marcus Aurelius, which we see with Aristotle. That part of it really is just having this tempered self, realizing that there are a lot of things that we can experience in the world that are wonderful if we are able to maintain our emotions and we're able to use reason to more calmly look at the world and to understand what is going on. Obviously, Plutarch can be intense because he does have very strong opinions about these things, but I think what you can distill outside of just the more intense moments of his writings is the idea that the way that we look at things really influences how we see the world, and being able to use reason to be able to understand our lives definitely goes a long way. And that a lot of it is realizing that there are a lot of things that do work to our advantage, even though it's hard to see this sometimes, and even though it can be really difficult. Now, I wanted to say, as a quick note, the book again is Plutarch's Essays, which you can find in a Penguin edition at any bookstore, and so I encourage you to check it out. I'm sure you can find Plutarch on the internet as well. He is probably part of the public domain, being an ancient writer. So I definitely encourage you to check it out. I think that there is a lot of exciting stuff that Plutarch and other philosophers of his tradition and tendencies tend to express, and it does do us good to remember that balance, and that realizing what we have is incredibly important, that moderation and moderating our moods and our feelings and our passions is valuable in a lot of ways whenever we can more fully understand the world and what is so special about our lives. I'm Phoenix, thank you for watching. I enjoyed making this video. Be sure to check out other videos in my Philosopher Series and other videos on my channel. And yeah, I'm Phoenix, thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.